So welcome everyone. My name is Sophia Cao. I'm the president of the Legal Women Voter of Southwest in the Clara Valley. We're serving the city of Los Gatos, Saratoga, Monte Sereno, and Campbell. So welcome to this morning's webinar. It's a series of the work by our Racial Justice Committee, and today's topic is California water. So before we start, and briefly introduce the Legal Women Voters. We have two distinct roles, voter service and advocacy. So LEAG provide the voter service events such as candidate forum, pros and cons, and event like today. But we never support or oppose any candidate or political parties. But even though we don't support any parties, after a careful study and the research, the League indeed takes some positions to advocate for or against certain issues. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce today's moderator of the California Water, our Natural Resource Chair, Meg Giberson. Meg, you may have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Sophia. Meg Giberson is my name. And I'm pleased to be here with you all. Thank you so much for attending this morning. We are privileged to have with us a really big crowd today. It's a group that we've never seen the size of before. We're close to 170 people. So we're going to proceed slightly differently than we have in the past. We're going, as you see, we have on our screen, the agenda is going to be our welcome now, and we're going to introduce the speaker, and she's going to be speaking to us for about maybe 50 minutes, 60 minutes. And during that time, would you please submit your questions in the chat? It'll go to me or to one of the other co-hosts. And then at the end, after Felicia has finished speaking, we will then address the questions and try to do what we do as a league, which is to coordinate the questions that come in if there are some similar ones and so on. So thank you again for joining us. It's great to have so many people today for this really important topic. Next slide. We suggest during the webinar that you keep your connection muted so that we don't have feedback or interference. And we, again, as I just mentioned, would you please submit all your questions to the moderator using chat. And if you're not familiar with the chat, if you go to the bottom usually of your screen, click on chat and a separate box will appear and you can type into it. And to send that chat question or comment, you just then have to hit your enter button to send it. Submitted questions will be reviewed and grouped together, and we'll be considering those at the end of the Q&A session. So those are our suggestions, and we'll move forward to the next slide. We're all here today because we all know that there is a freshwater crisis. And it's not just a crisis, it's a crisis for every place that we get our water from, which is the streams and the mountains and rivers and the bays. And it affects all of California and most of the West. And it's a freshwater crisis. Other parts of the world also are suffering from a freshwater crisis. So who do we turn to when we want suggestions and solutions for our crisis? Our speaker, Felicia Marcus, is here with us today, and she's going to be sharing with us her 35 years in water, solving water problems for California and beyond. She's smart, she's funny, she has had a vast experience in all aspects of California water. She earned her cum laude degree at Harvard in Southern Studies. She attended Hong Kong University and she got her law at NYU. She then of water. She spent years in LA as head of the Department of Public Works there. She sewers, as I heard her say one time. She has served as the head of the US EPA, which includes California. She has been chair of the State Water Board. She's currently a fellow at Stanford's Water in the West program. She has dealt over the years with drinking water quality and availability, floods, water rights laws, groundwater management, wastewater recycling, desalination, you kind of name it. And Felicia has been part of dealing with that. She now consults nationally and internationally as a member of the Water Policy Group. And with that, it's my extreme privilege to turn the program over to Felicia Marcus. And please thank you, Felicia, and we welcome you with arms.
Well, thank you, Meg, for the generous introduction and for inviting me to join you. I know sometimes my experience makes me sound like a dilettante because I've just hopped all over the place, but I think that does position me well to give you a flavor of the issues at a broad scale, and then we can dive into it. So my aim is just to give you in some ways a menu and an overview and some bits of a framework, and then I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So I'll have a lot of slides. I'll linger on only a few of them, but I find, as I'll explain more deeply later, that one of the biggest problems in discourse about water is the fragmentation, not just of the agencies, which we have in California in particular, to be sure, although it's not uniquely California, but the breadth of the issues where people will look at one thread of it and think it's the whole thing, or think it's one big bucket of water that somebody's allocating. And it's actually lots of bits and pieces of things, both in terms of the substance of it, the architecture of how we manage it or don't manage it, depending on how you look at the topic, the number of issues, and the players. So hopefully I can give you a menu that will be helpful to some of you, but I know there may be people who want to go much deeper on some of these. So I hope I've made the right choices here, but I'm very happy to join you on a Saturday morning, and I hope you've got your coffee with you, because I am going to go rather quickly and somewhat superficially over some very deep issues. And I'm really personally overwhelmed, frankly, looking at the sign-in sheet that so many of you are taking the time to chat with me on your weekend. And I'm going to say right at the outset, I have looked at the list, at least as of a day or so ago, and you've got some real experts in the audience, which is always a bit daunting. So I hope they won't fault me for not including an issue or wherever I go, but we can correct that. And I might even call on some of them, because you actually have some huge expertise in the room, including some people who have been my mentors over the years, which is always a little bit daunting. But I'm really, again, as I said, I'm looking forward to the conversation. We can go anywhere. I can't tell you how often I'll give what I think is an overview, and then someone will zero in on a really important issue that I just didn't put in for lack of space. So don't hesitate to go outside, because my aim is to be helpful. One note on social justice before I talk. I've worked extensively over the decades in the environmental justice movement as a cultural ally, both as a public interest lawyer in Los Angeles and as a government official. So I'm just going to give you a dance through the issues in which there are environmental justice and social justice issues embedded in everything about water. This is part of the challenge of water and the discourse, in that water touches everything, and it touches everything so much that it gets left out of the high level political discourse, but that's changing. So I will dance through most things fairly superficially, but we can dive back in. I know you're going to have some very good speakers, particularly in the drinking water issue, who are heroic architects of the voyage we're on now to make good on the human right to water. So I hope I touch the right things. But one final, I know I'm giving you a lot of caveats for the morning, that maybe that's a better reason for all to hoping you're caffeinated. For those of you who've heard my take on California water before, know that you're going to see some of the same things, because it hasn't changed. And so I always feel it's important to give this overall architecture before launching into anything specific. So there's some issues where I may bring you to the depths of despair, but trust me, towards the end, I'm going to show you a lot of things that give me hope. And although there are some things in the last few years that break my heart, there actually are a lot of things that give me hope, which is where I've been spending my time since leaving the state board. So let's, without further ado, let me get there. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to give you that context, going to give you signs of hope. I'm going to spotlight and come back to a few issues. Bay Delta recycling and EJ in the context of drinking water. Again, somewhat superficial, but I hope it, again, food for thought here and for future discussion. And as I always do, I feel like I have to say that the human dimension shouldn't be an afterthought, but is the heart of what's missing at the center of the water world. If we talk just about economics or politics or the environment or legal issues or regulatory issues, we miss the fact that all of this work and progress on any issue have to do with people. And I'll say right now at the outset that I've worked in the air, water, waste, land use, climate, energy worlds, and water is the most fragmented and where people talk past each other across the decades in partial pieces of an issue. And so I see this human dimension as being the biggest problem we have in making progress in water. And I tend to call it the challenge of ecosystem management. So with time, I'll get into that in the end. You know, water is seen as a wicked problem. A lot of people will use this meme, not just for water, but climate and a lot of issues. And it gets framed in the sense of it being the issue is just too hard. It's undefinable, unknowable, unstoppable. When in fact, at least in water and in climate, but in water, it's very definable, knowable, and fixable. But we don't get to it because the nature of the discourse makes it feel too fragmented and difficult, requires some political will and leadership to make progress. But I really think the discourse frequently is towards this element intentionally in order to exclude people and to keep the discourse into a small group of I won't say high priesthood, but the circles of advocates in every world in some ways that just stay locked in sort of mortal combat, tossing their talking points past each other across the decades, when in fact, I think part of the answer is to democratize the issue, get information out there and engage people. And you'll see, I'm going to talk a little bit about where I say signs of hope there. The other point I wanted to leave you with as you see the waves of issues that come across the transom is the difference between sustainability and resilience. And I'm not going to get all Merriam-Webster on you on this one, but there is a really big difference. And I think some people see the resilience word as just the buzzword that has substituted for the sustainability buzzword that we've been hearing for the past couple of decades. But there actually is a big difference, whether it's in the corporate arena or in almost any circle that you come up with. When we talk about sustainability, we're talking about being able to last over time, but we're talking about living within our means, as if you have a closed loop that you could estimate. This is something engineers can do. You can use models, you can use formulas, etc. Resilience brings in two other notions that are really, really important and a little scary if you don't pay attention to them. One is the notion that you've got to be able to expect the unexpected, that the norms that we're going to be seeing, the ranges, whether it's the traditional 100-year flood kind of a measurement, out the window with climate change. We're going to see extremes of precipitation on both ends of the scale in different geographies, et cetera, that are not in the planning dialogue or history or discourse that we've been using for a very long time. And so whether it's massive heat waves that actually are going to kill people in places like the Northwest or British Columbia that are unseen, or historic colds in Texas, or even the swings of drought and flood that we're going to see, where we're going to see drier dries and more frequent dries. And then we're going to see massive floods on a scale that we haven't seen for years. It requires a whole different look at how do we come back? The second point, how do we come back from disruption? Because there's no way there's enough money or human energy in the world to plan for every eventuality we're going to see at those extremes. You can't do everything for a 500 or 1,000-year flood because it would be prohibitively expensive and impossible, and you couldn't predict everywhere to do it, and you'd definitely leave something out. And so we're going to have to get mental toughness here a little bit in terms of thinking about broader ranges and more expensive ranges than we have to date, to be sure, but also planning our systems in a way that can recover from disruption. And there are a lot of ways to do that. That one of the silver linings of that is people recognizing, for example, that what are known as nature-based solutions and using nature can actually yield more resilience and recovery. For example, setting back floodplains to disperse the force of flows while also sinking water into the ground and providing ecosystem versus channelizing everything everywhere. And that's happening in the urban and rural context. So it's not all bad, but it requires, it's going to require us to do a big old investment over the next decade or two in order to put ourselves in new space. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And we're going to have to, as I said, we're going to have to get more comfortable with complexity. So we're going to need more than resilient infrastructure, though. We're going to need more resilient and flexible institutions, more resilient relationships among groups, because we're all in this together and we're wasting our time, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic at the moment. And we're going to need more mindful and resilient approaches where we figure out how to get multiple benefits over the same scarce local dollars, which requires reaching out beyond our high priesthoods or silos of excellence in whether it's engineering or transportation, transportation engineers and other engineers, sanitary engineers and other engineers, they have their own silos of language and discourse. So, but there's signs of hope. I don't mean to be a downer. I'm not going to linger on this. I'm just going to mention this in a sense, because I've been spending time the last 3 years more in the international arena, not just to get away from Bay Delta as a mental health break, but because I've always wanted to get back into that field. And I see the field of climate adaptation and water as the most crucial thing that we can do in the water world over the decades. And frankly, folks are ahead internationally to where we are locally. But there is at the international level a much greater sense of water as a source of life, a much keener awareness of water as a source of conflict, meaning even armed conflict over time. And there are places in the world today where it's happened and where the specter of it is looming over people, whether it's Egypt and Ethiopia with the Grand Renaissance Dam, or Turkey and other areas, or the many things written about the Syrian war being an outgrowth of drought. But it also can be this major unifying cause and theme if we get it together, an unappreciated player in the energy worlds and other worlds to solve problems. Also, most importantly, is the bleeding edge of climate change, where people will feel it in flooding and drought and, sea level rise. And so my question over the past few years is, has water's moment come? We're seeing that. I'm just give you a little bit of optimism before I hop into the basics. The Sustainable Development Goals that the UN sets, again, no force of law, but an incredible moral force and organizing principle in gaining the attention of countries more than you would think, because we don't talk about the UN and Sustainable Development Goals in the discourse in the US as much as they do in other countries who do take it more seriously, or in the corporate world, frankly. The international corporate sustainability movement actually has a lot of really good things going on in it. And those goals include the human right to water and the right to clean, safe, and affordable water and sanitation. And you see it as a motivating force in other parts of the world as a grand challenge for us all to reach for. In the climate discourse and policy, and Meg mentioned being at COP26, I've been at a few of them over the years, and there is a growing movement that I've seen even just in the last few years grow, and have great hopes for the next one in Sharm el-Sheikh, that there's a change on a number of fronts. In the climate world, there's been an emphasis on mitigation, reducing emissions, and an exclusion in the discourse of thinking about adaptation, what we have to do to be prepared for it, with the sense in the advocacy world and some other worlds that it was capitulation, and that we could only do one thing at a time. It's like we couldn't walk and talk at the same time. We had to choose between, Paul and John, or Coke and Pepsi. I don't know, maybe it's a natural human thing. I think it's a mistake because this is clearly a both and looking at what we need to do to adapt actually is more accessible to regular people than parts per million in the atmosphere or degrees centigrade or even feet of sea level rise. But if you look at what we have to do to recover from these floods or prevent harm from the floods, it's much more motivating in terms of limiting emissions. And the Secretary General of the UN and the discourse, adaptation is finally starting to get its due. Water was actually mentioned on the main stage. It had a whole pavilion in the side events. There are countries doing net zero pledges on water. There are corporate net zero pledges on, the country net zero pledges on climate. We can get into those if you're interested. There's some rough spots, but corporate net zero on water, and even some like Google, who said every watershed they're going to go in, they're going to make 20% better than before they got there through a variety of means. The other thing I'd point out, which gives me tremendous hope and that I've spent a lot of time on domestically and internationally, is this elevation of nature-based solutions with water and climate benefits, but certainly a lot of other benefits that come with it. It's being elevated in the discourse more there than nationally, although certainly it's in the infrastructure bill that passed in terms of ecological forest management and other things. There's a lot of money in the bill for that. The climate approach there and internationally is including land-based emissions as well as just sequestration, because we now have wildfires that are so big and hot that they're emitting more carbon overall than fires traditionally did. And some say, and there's in the IPCC reports that there are years, and there will be increasing ones, where there are more emissions from that source than even from fossil fuel. So we've got to deal with it or we're not going to make it. So again, and some encouraging things at the state level I'm happy to talk about. So with that as a bigger picture opening, I'm going to go to one slide I'm going to spend a little time on, and I encourage you to screenshot it and save it or however you want to do. This is the wallet card I did fairly early on in my returning to California water after 7 years running away from it and doing land use and other issues, because I saw this dynamic of people talking past each other or talking about their issue in water as if it were the only issue. And it reminded me of that parable of the blind man and the elephant, where they're each touching one part of this amazing creature and describing it to each other. And there's no way this could be one creature. And that's what it felt like coming back in, seeing the same people, a little older, a little grayer, maybe even a little heavier, talking past each other the same way they had when I left 7 years before, but very earnestly talking about a slice of the problem with all sincerity, oblivious to the fact that it was connected to others or that other people might see it a different way. And so the discourse that I would see in the media and even in the policy discourse was more like what I call an is so, is not, you're a jerk, no, I'm not level of discourse, or a Monty Python routine. And it's shockingly worse in water than it is in air and energy and other things. I mean, it's remarkable. So I see this as part of the challenge, but I really did this slide to give people a wallet card just to arm them, if for nothing else, dinner party or cocktail conversation, where someone would say, if they do this one thing, it will solve everything. Everybody's a jerk or evil that doesn't see that, whether we're going to ever be able to build enough dams to do it, or we could do it all through conservation and recycling. We can't. We have to take a holistic look and think in this more complicated way that I referenced earlier. So here are just the key high points you need to know about California water to arm yourself in those conversations against the guy or the woman that's got that one simple answer where he or she is smarter than everybody else and everybody else is evil or stupid. We know that's not true now that I name it, but think about how many times you're in a conversation where that happens. And by being a member of this organization, there's no question in my mind that you get that. And by being here on a Saturday morning, no question that you want to know what the real facts are rather than the slogans and the sound bites. So key things to know about California, there's a lot more. Has the most variable hydrology in the country. That matters. That means it rains, it pours, it's not predictable. we are absolutely the most variable in the nation. And that means our planning's got to be a little different than in other places where they know, think about other parts of the world where you can almost set your clock by the monsoon. They're not going to be able to anymore with climate change, but where people know it's going to rain all through the summer. Again, there are places it rains in the summer. That's different than California, right? So we have to have a different system and a different way of looking at water, and it varies year to year. We, again, not predictable, it varies location to location, varies by the time of year. And in part, we use most of our water not in the season in which it falls, not in the place in which it falls. Here's the other thing. It's not one big bucket of water that we are allocating out from the center. It's a mix of sources wherever you are. I mean, where you all are on the peninsula is particularly confusing because you've got so many different water sources coming to you, which I'm going to show you. There are a lot of parts of the state where people know where their water comes from because they can see it going by. Or they know it's right under their feet because everybody has a groundwater pump. But by far the vast majority of Californians get their water from hundreds of miles away through pipes underground where they don't really know where it comes from, or they get a mix of it from all sorts of places. I mean, frankly, the more the better if you're in a dry zone. Some places 100% dependent on groundwater. Some folks don't have any and wish they did. And you also have a very different mix of water rights from senior to junior, which I'm only going to touch on briefly because it could eat the whole presentation. It's very much more in the news this year, so I'm also happy to talk about in Q&A. Again, I'm teeing up for our discussion. And so as a result, you have a very different impact of something like drought. And logically, there are a mix of solutions: conservation, recycling, stormwater, even desal in some appropriate circumstances, but limited, I think. Integrated water management in regions and statewide is the name of the game, as I've been talking about. You have one of the best facilitators of that sort of work, bridge builders, in the audience, Regina Hirsch. And then some basics people should know. I mean, we've got a lot of people and we're going to have more. We're huge. Most people live hundreds of miles from their water. We're one of only 5 large-scale Mediterranean climates that can grow the level of healthy fruits and vegetables we can. So ag is not just a soundbite. It's actually important to us and the rest of the world. And we've got a lot of biodiversity and we're losing it fast. And we have a very fragmented water system and a very not built out water rights system. And climate change and other drivers are going to change the game for us. Now, just a few quick slides. This just is a Dettinger dot chart that kind of demonstrates to people like dart charts that we're just more variable than anybody else. That's the way the color gradation goes. The people and the precipitation aren't where the people and precipitation aren't in the same place. We have feast or famine. The Colorado River is equally important to Southern California as Sierra water via the Delta, but we don't talk about it as much. That, again, I've done whole presentations on. I'm not going to do that today. And then here, one of the things that is important is that modern California is made possible because of the infrastructure we have. Now, most of this was built during an era where we didn't think about the ecological consequences of building all of this and moving water away from its natural ecosystem. And that's been the source of fights that people like Peter Dreckmeyer is on the call and others on the call have been waging for decades, and one that feels at times like a losing battle as we try to just course correct, not even a massive amount, but just enough to keep our fish populations and ecosystems alive and healthy, which is important, I think, to our sense of our souls, but also important to indigenous tribes, subsistence fishers, and an entire commercial fishery that's been devastated at the time that California land-based ag has been growing in production and earnings. But we're in a course correction phase. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. But you see the Owens Valley Aqueduct in LA that many people think is all of LA's water because they've seen Chinatown, but it's actually a smaller fraction as LA gave up a big chunk of their water to help save Mono Lake and deal with air pollution in the Owens Valley. And Martha Davis is on, who's a real hero of that battle over the decades. But it's small, but the LA is dependent on both the Colorado and the state and federal, the State Water Project, which is the orange bar The purple is the federal water project that tends more towards, not exclusive, more towards ag. The state water project is ag and urban, but geared a little more towards urban, and there are pieces up north. So you just see how complex it is. The one point I want to make for my friends in the Bay Area, I know there are some people from Southern California, is that the green Hetch Hetchy and McCullumney line, McCullumney going to East Bay Mud, Hetch Hetchy going to San Francisco and a lot of the South Bay, is also taking water from the Delta. It's just taking it above the pumps. So you don't hear about it as much, but make no mistake, that water that you're drinking that comes from those rivers is hurting a fish just as much as the water that's going through the pump. So I just always ask for a little humility from my Northern California friends. The drought we had in the middle of the tens was an enormous wake-up call for our vulnerability. Again, if we think about it, we've got the geophysical record shows we've had droughts of 40 and 400 years. I mean, that variation is far more stark than the 3 or 4 year drought cycle we're used to seeing from the last 100 or so years we've kept records. So shame on us for being so surprised every time it goes a little bit longer or it's a little bit more odd. That galvanized an awful lot of work that's very important. You know, one of my slides I must have inadvertently taken out. So I'm going to stop a minute before I go further. Maybe it'll pop up later. Maybe I scrambled them. The key thing in that this system is that it is dependent on storage, but storage of a different kind than you think. Sure, some of the reservoirs and dams you're seeing here make a big difference and can extend water resources for a few years in some cases. The biggest single source of storage we have is our snowpack. And with a few degrees temperature rise, we're going to lose it. It's going to melt out, and we're going to end up with more flooding in the spring and less reserved in that snowpack that's going to melt out in the spring and maybe even in the beginning of summer in some cases to refill that reservoir system. I mean, the reservoir amount isn't just the amount that's in it at the moment. It's the amount that it also gets refilled with snowpack and precipitation over the course of the year. And so the snowpack is very important to that scenario. It's also important for rewatering the streams, for sinking water into our groundwater basins, et cetera. And we're just seeing less of it already with heat as more of the water evaporates up into the air, is taken up by plants, et cetera. So we're seeing runoff droughts as well as droughts themselves. So again, in terms of that resilience frame, we're already starting to see disruption, but we should have known better because we could have seen larger droughts to begin with. The issue that we have and the opportunity is that we're never going to replace that with more reservoirs. The only thing that can compensate in size for that loss of snowpack are our groundwater basins, which have been overdrafted. So you can see where there's a win there potentially, and I'll show you a little bit about where that's coming in. Here for people who like pictures, a reminder of that drought. Here for people who like graphs, a reminder of that drought and where we were in 2015 and how chilling, frightening, and painful that was to not just to those of us in the public policy arena, but to the people thousands of people whose wells ran dry, to the tens of thousands who were standing in unemployment lines, and to the 500,000 acres of farm fields that were fallowed. Of course, then it's followed by some gangbuster years. And if you like pictures, you'll remember when Oroville nearly failed. So again, we have to plan for both. That's a good problem to have compared to some parts of the world like South Africa, where it's just going to get drier. They're not going to get the deluges that they can get underground or that they can sock away in reservoirs. So be thankful for those problems we're going to have, but be mindful of the need to prepare for floods, because that's where you get death and immediate mayhem. Here's just where we are right now. I thought I needed to put this in. Any of you who've been looking at these slides will realize it's very much a different picture than we saw only a month ago when we had the gangbuster 2 months of snow and it looked like we were in good shape. And you heard those of us who may have sounded like, you know, negative nabobs or Nellies talking about, hey, don't let her rip in terms of water deliveries, because once it starts getting warm, the spigot could get cut off, and you see this shows sort of all of the ones, happily the ones that are at average. They're usually not all full at this time of year because we're midway through the wet season, but there are a lot more under average than were even a month ago. Because again, the averages are weighted towards precipitation that goes throughout, not that big deluge and then the spigot gets turned out, which happened to us just a few years ago as well in 2012. Here's that picture. I don't know how it got scrambled here, but this terrified us. I had this one on the bathroom mirror for a while. So I've talked about this a little bit, and I'm going to move on just to get to the conversation here without going through everything. This was the Brown administration approach, not to the drought, but to recognizing this climate change challenge of losing our snowpack. That between climate whiplash and just the heat of losing our snowpack, we were going to have more pressure on an already overallocated pressured system. And so it was an all of the above, with conservation first and foremost, integrated water management, and a whole bunch of things like recycling, stormwater capture, et cetera, dealing with the delta, getting ahead of the curve to protect the ecosystems, getting prepared, expanding storage capacity, but primarily groundwater management and below, which is why you saw Jerry Brown use so much of his political capital to finally get the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act passed in 2014, which I am not going to talk about because it could take a whole topic. I'll mention it, but again, we can talk about it and how it's going in the Q&A if anyone's interested. Providing safe drinking water for all communities, that's a first for a governor. He signed the Human Right to Water Act and he really took it seriously. I'll talk a little bit about that, flood protection, a bunch of other things. The Newsom administration has largely continued it. They built on it in an update as is appropriate. Ours was only meant to lay a foundation, also based on a portfolio, all of the above approach, but with more nuance and discussion on regional approaches because of these differences, multi-benefit investments, technology, innovation, data, all very good, I think, building upon it. And although the pandemic caused a postponement of the bond that was being put together to fund the next bond after the ones we did, there were some huge budget adds in the last few years. So let me give you a sense of the mindset that I want to leave you. And I know for those of you who heard me, this is kind of a broken record for me, along with ecosystem management, is that I think there's a lot of lore and faith-based argument in the water world. And I think we need to just deal with reality. That's always been my more practical approach. And many of the stars on the call are my colleagues in that. And I love this quote: "I'm a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts and beer." Now, I'm not going to get into all my beer jokes today because I decided not to take the time on it, but beer does come up a lot in historical figure discourse. But the real point is to bring the real facts. So I want to roll through some of the real facts, not to discuss them in full, but to just get them in your mind as relevant to the issue. But I realized that Abraham Lincoln was, kind of old. So I started looking to young it up a little bit. And I found this quote from Ice Cube: "I think to me, reality is better than being fake," which is kind of how I look at life and the world. And again, I suspect you do too, because you want to know stuff. Not everybody wants to know stuff. But then I realized, I wasn't really younging up that much. It was all relative to go to Ice Cube, because I think he's in his 40s. But I also realized it was kind of funny that I was quoting Ice Cube, because he's also the guy who invented the phrase "Bye, Felicia." And I'm not going to explain that. If you know it, you're probably my age, but it's kind of ironic that I would quote Ice Cube. Again, that reality, the most important one to be aware of, again, matching the scale of what's underground that you'll see. Population's going to rise. Sea level rise is going to pack a punch. I'll talk about it in the Bay Area in particular, puts more pressure on the Delta system as well, but it's going to be enormous. So for example, you can see where you are, and some of you may be underwater in a little while. I think this is the 2100 estimates. The estimates are that of all of the economic damage, and that's just economic, from sea level rise over that period, for all of California, 2/3 of it is in the San Francisco Bay. So no time like the present. And fortunately, as I'll show you, there's a lot going on. another reality, the Delta is the central challenge. It's not the only challenge. Not everybody gets water from the Delta, either above or through the pumps, but most of California does in one way or another, in whole or in part. And we haven't been able over the decades to come to grips with the fact that we've simply taken more water out of this system than any ecosystem has ever survived. And ours is not surviving, with fish populations plummeting, not just a given fish, but the whole ecosystem not functioning the way ecosystems go. And as some of you know, and Peter knows particularly well, the Water Board has struggled to set those standards for how much water needs to go through that very fragile Delta system, where water's been diverted on all these tributaries, 22 or 23 of them in the Sacramento Valley and the Delta, Northern Delta arena, and 4, 5, 6, 7, 4, 5, maybe 4, 5, really, depending on how you count it, on the San Joaquin River system, starting with Friant and then going to the Merced, the Tuolumne, and the Stanislaus. We just take more of it out at critical times of year that totally interrupts the ecological life cycle that fish and other critters they eat are evolved around. And we just haven't been able, we've made progress at times, whether the Bay Delta Accord or the Delta Reform Act, or even the baby steps we did with setting standards for the lower San Joaquin tributaries, but we haven't implemented those and we haven't finished. So it drags on for decades with hopes of voluntary agreement and varying levels of stomach for making the hard regulatory choices that need to be made so people can figure out how to adapt to it. And before, I wouldn't bet any money on whether we're going to be able to do it before we lose even more species. There's just something important, again, for the Bay Area folks. When it comes to water coming through the Delta via the Delta pumps at the bottom, and again, I haven't talked about the architecture. I can go back to that if you want to. The Bay Area itself is 33% dependent on that. Southern California is 30% dependent on that. Now, it's a bigger number in Southern California because the population numbers are bigger. Kern County, 23%, but this is just water coming through the Delta, and some areas are 100% dependent. If you look at the total imports of water from the Delta, including above the Delta, it's closer to 65% if you count Hetch Hetchy and McCulney. And folks in Northern California think every drop that falls on Northern California is their water. It's not, sorry. It's from a different watershed. It's not your watershed. You may have seen your water right to it because the way the water right system worked over 100 years ago, but it's actually, the people who live in those watersheds don't necessarily look at it that way. And if you add Marin and its dependence on Mendocino and Sonoma, the number gets even higher. So it's not a competition. I'm just saying, if anybody's holier than thou, just drop it, because we all have issues. My other picture didn't come up. I'm sorry. It's on my screen, but not yours. This was just another picture I put up to give you a sense of where a lot of water in the Bay Area comes from. And it kind of, you see, if you're where you are, most of you are in Santa Clara Valley, you have the most diverse sources of water, even coming from the Delta. So you're getting State Water Project, you're getting Hetch Hetchy water, depending on where you are, and you're relying on the Central Valley Project. It's unique, but also over a large groundwater basin, which is pretty well managed. And a growing level of recycling, mostly purple pipe, and the promise with Valley Water's demonstration center of a much larger recycling presence that hasn't actually happened yet. But you're the most complex in this way. And if you start looking at different parts of San Mateo and others, you have people that are getting water from multiple sources. So again, very complex picture for you. Ecosystems plummeting, ag is a precious resource. The lack of groundwater management has been a problem in the sense that the ground is sinking, which matters for infrastructure and reducing that precious storage place. This is a famous picture of a guy standing there in 1977 showing where the ground was in 25. That pole is long gone, and the water levels are, hundreds of feet, if not more, lower, and we're losing flood capacity and conveyance capacity all over the place. But again, that ends up giving us this large remaining bucket of places where we can slow it, store it, and sink water for use in the future. And the SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, is an ongoing effort where lots of groups are working on figuring out how to live within their means, both through managed aquifer recharge to get more in the ground faster than would naturally flow, but also through demand management. And the estimates are we're going to lose 500,000 to 1.5 million acres of farmland in order to live within their means. And that is a much bigger hit to ag, a necessary one if they want their grandchildren to farm, than anything we've ever taken for a fish. Another way to look at it, if you like that kind of satellite data. And then we have an issue of groundwater contamination that pervades the state from historical, industrial, and agricultural use. The key thing on this map is to know that if you're in LA and in a larger water district where you have a blend of surface and groundwater and you have the capacity to treat water, which is not at all rocket science, it's just the application of energy and money, then you're fine. So a lot of these areas in LA that are in a Superfund site even, they're fine because they have the capacity to blend and treat and manage their water. I won't say fine, but it's not as scary. If you're on a groundwater well, either in a small system in urban LA or in the rural parts of the state, then you're in a world of hurt because you've been drinking crappy water for a long time, even if your well didn't run dry. And so this has been an issue that we've elevated over the past decade through reports on nitrogen contamination, but a lot of it is also natural from Chrome-6, arsenic, and other things. There are also pesticides. And again, if you can treat, it's one thing. If you can't, you can't. We'll talk a little bit about what the state's been doing to try and improve on that issue if you want to. And that's one where environmental justice rings very true because a lot of these communities are African-American, Latino communities that were either redlined out of a water district or where people have come there because they had nowhere else to go, or whether they're farm workers, ironically drinking contaminated water from shallow wells when they work all day in the fields that are watered by more pristine surface water to which chemicals are added. So it's a very complex, sad story, but one where the state has been stepping up over the last decade through the heroic work of a lot of the disadvantaged community advocates, one of whom you will hear from in specifically about this story in a couple of weeks, and people like Martha Davis, who's on the call and on the Community Water Center board, who's been a leading bridge between the traditional water community and the environmental justice water community. In safe drinking water, though, a lot's going on. Standard setting for some key chemicals, consolidating. We got the tools in the legislature to consolidate small systems with larger systems. Again, a very complex issue, but one will get people clean, safe water more affordably through an economy of scale, because there's no way little teeny districts will ever have enough money or managerial, technical, financial capacity to be able to meet modern standards on a range of contaminants, because it's not just one treatment method. Each contaminant might have a completely different treatment train needed. We had a lot of money for capital and state revolving fund loans, but again, you can't loan money or build facilities for people who can't afford to even operate and manage it. We worked on agricultural nitrogen loading standards through the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, the toughest in the country, still a work in progress and an experiment in collective implementation we hope will work. And then finally, in the Newsom administration, after we failed 2 years in a row, we got funding to actually subsidize operation and maintenance for poor communities and hire administrators and others to be able to consolidate, create better shapes and sizes. Still a work in progress, but something right at the top of the water board's agenda. Infrastructure is aging and inadequate again, and we don't need to rebuild it all as gray infrastructure. We can do more green. The wildfires you've seen over the past few years are just going to get worse, emitting more carbon, a disaster of contamination for water, but also a disaster for the environment. And perhaps the reason why we're finally getting hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, to deal with the issue is a mix of the carbon emissions, but more than that, death and destruction that follows the very human dimension. And we can solve that problem a little bit, but also solve a bunch of others through nature-based solutions. Our water rights system, I've mentioned, we did a lot of things during the drought. There are things going on to try and at least digitize it, but we've got the most unwieldy, unworkable system as a system, unadjudicated, unquantified in the country, which surprises people because we're California, but that's a political and funding issue, but we have some elements of it that are better than other parts of the country. A strong public trust doctrine, a strong waste and unreasonable use prohibition in our Constitution, which potentially gives the Water Board way better tools. But again, the process makes it almost impossible to easily wave a magic wand. They're balancing statutes, and because they're water rights, evidentiary adjudicatory hearings that can take years, and thousands of participants are necessary to do it, except in an emergency and except when you use your regulatory authority. Water conservation was really the hottest issue during the drought. It's the one most people ask about, so I'm going to even save it for the Q&A. Again, Martha and others on the call, Connor and Lynn, are real experts in this, but we did a lot during the drought, and urban California really stepped up to save nearly 25%, largely by losing their lawns, by being more thrifty, by dealing with leaks. There's a huge way we can go to be way more efficient, to make ourselves more resilient in the urban context. And you do have efficiency happening in the agricultural context, but largely it's gone to, those savings have gone to produce more product rather than be left in a stream. Here's just a slide I won't go through for time, but just give you an idea. There's a lot that we did in the last decade to put us in better shape, but much farther to go, again, in this complex issue. I was going to spotlight the Bay Delta, but I actually did talk about it a fair amount as we went. Just know that the conflict's not just between fish and farmers. That's the one that's comfortable for people to talk about, but there are massive conflicts between and among farmers with different kinds of water rights or different geographies. The fights between the poor Delta farmers and the export contractors, they're both farmers, very rich farmland, are just as fierce, if not more so, than they are between environmentalists and water users. A lot of it is about plumbing, and people tend to ask about the tunnels project. Again, I could eat the conversation. I'm happy to talk about it ad nauseum if you want later on, or we could do a specific follow-up on the Delta where we can actually get into it. But again, the issues of plumbing are engineering solutions that miss the heart of where the problem is, which is there's just not actually trust. That even if you built it with the best conditions in the world, and we were in a long scale 2-year evidentiary hearing over this on the old tunnel project, the Water Board could put perfect conditions on it to make it just, you can only take it when it's enormous and in excess, and you can't other times. But I'm not sure people would believe that the Water Board would ever be allowed to implement their own rules. So we do have a big trust and operational knot that we have to solve. The water quality control plans I briefly mentioned, where we did the Lower San Joaquin with help from Peter and others, are a very complex knot, but the Water Board's in a unique position where it's supposed to set standards that maximize the benefits of all users, to find that fair sweet spot. Doing the plans are hard politically. Figuring out how to implement them through the water rights system can take a decade or more. So they do tend to be resolved through voluntary agreements. We've been in an unfortunate period where not much has happened, as people have tried to do voluntary agreements in the absence of regulation moving forward, which becomes impossible because there's nothing to force the agreement. You always need something to force the agreement, whether it's a court or a regulation or something, or in the case of the Bay Delta Court, it was my folks when I was at EPA saying to the state, we're going to implement a plan if you don't. And that's a powerful driving force, to not have another level of government do it to you. So a lot going on here again, and a lot that you all really have a lot to do with in the Bay Area, not just if you get it through the Delta pumps, but if you're in getting your water from one of those entities that's taking it above, because they are, let's just say SFPUC is among the fiercest opponents of setting higher standards. East Bay Mud tends to be more collaborative when it comes to fish, frankly. That's all I'll say about that. Recycling is really a bright spot. It's someplace where at times this area has led, and other times surprisingly not. In an interesting way, you have more purple pipe here than many other areas. I mean, good conservation over the years, although there's a conundrum as to why folks didn't heed the call from Valley Water quite as quickly, especially in the absence of Anderson Dam. They're very vulnerable, and so conservation should be first and foremost. But there's a lot of collaboration on recycled water. The potable world is really growing in terms of groundwater recharge, and even direct potable rules will be out in 2023. We put $1.5 billion out during the drought to take a lot of plans from the drawing board into the ground. It's been fun to go to ribbon cuttings in the years since for having been helpful in funding those projects. But there are also regs that have streamlined the groundwater replenishment, reservoir augmentation, and direct potable rules will be out in 2023. Huge plans in Southern California out of necessity that I'll mention in a minute, but a lot more that could be done here to take the Valley Water project from a demonstration project to a real full-scale, much larger project. And the good news is there are answers here. You know, there are things to do. They're just a bit expensive. I can talk more about this. And EJ and drinking water, you're going to hear a lot from Susana de Anda, but this is probably the area where EJ has had its biggest impact. It comes up in all toxics regulation about water. It comes up in water supply costs. It comes up in the Bay Delta in terms of indigenous and subsistence fishers and the like. So I don't want to say it's just about this, but this is an arena where we've seen the most progress over the last decade because of this coalition of amazing activists, particularly the Community Water Center, the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, and Clean Water Action as a cultural ally, and really transforming the state to a human right, first human right to water state in the country, to getting legislation to allow enforced consolidations, and a whole bunch of other things, including the subsidies. So there's a great thing here. There's a new alliance developing between the urban and the rural areas, because there are plenty of urban challenges here. In some cases, it may hit more population, but they're in spaces that have more tools available to them. So we prioritized rural communities, had nowhere else to turn, but increasingly the water board is moving in that direction as well. And I've been spending some time in that space. And there are a coalition between folks in agriculture and disadvantaged communities. That's one of the things I'm most proud of and pleased to see over time that we can talk about it. And a whole empowerment movement to get more community members on myriad small water boards, which also makes my heart soar. And again, this integration of water and also technology, you can look at Australia and how they've reorganized themselves. You can look at Israel and their use of technology and how they've organized themselves. You can go shopping in Water 4.0, which I recommend in terms of looking at this evolution of water. And you can think more about this integration of all things so that you get the most bang for the buck. And this is where we're seeing incredible things. In Santa Clara, I've talked a bit about a lot of the efforts. You have a lot going on in terms of on-site in the corporate arena. You've got some really good recycling. You could have a lot more. You usually have really great response to water conservation. I'm not sure why it lagged so much at this last drought, but you've got amazing large-scale things happening in Southern California, including what will be the largest potable reuse project in the world, coming out of Los Angeles with 100% recycling goal. I'm on the technical advisory group for that. Metropolitan doesn't just import water from the Delta. They've been doing an awesome job of socking it away in above ground off-stream reservoir and groundwater, doing trades, a whole bunch of different things, but they're also doing a nearly as big recycled water program. Both of those will be bigger than Orange County's, which is currently the biggest in the world. So Southern California is going to be the epicenter of climate adaptation for water in a dry climate. And if you add their stormwater capture in their Measure W, 300 million a year, it's watch this space the next decade. Up here, though, you have great opportunities. I'm going to talk about another really good example of what I think will be world-breaking leadership. And also in the Bay Area, and this is the slide the picture that didn't show up, you also have had in the last decade the myriad Bay Area water agencies you have coming together to form a regional collaborative where they're starting to do interties so they can trade water off, so that one's plenty can help, abundance can help somebody who doesn't have, say doesn't have groundwater. People, when they have a lot of surface water, can put it into groundwater. The Sacramento area did this a couple decades ago, and the Bay Area is working on that, which is important. But we need to take a much bigger leap. And I mentioned in LA, the mayor's water directive, which was to reduce their reliance on imported water by 70%, which is a big deal because they were 88% dependent on Metropolitan during the last drought. And they're going to do it through a combination of recycling, stormwater capture, conservation, and cleaning up groundwater basins. But it's a big, big lift, and they're on their way. You also see some amazing things happening in ag. This is Don Cameron, probably my favorite farmer. I have a lot of them actually, but trying to figure out how to get more water in the ground during the wet years. You have folks working on upper forest management to yield benefits for water and flood control. So you have the flood, you have the upper watershed, you have the floodplain setbacks making progress. In LA, we have this Measure W I talked about, 300 million a year for stormwater management using green solutions. So you're going to see the face of LA County transform with more green spaces used to capture floodwaters when they come, get them in the ground, clean up the runoff before it goes out to the bay. It's very exciting. And the urban area, you have a coalition that came together to deal with this sea level rise issue, but to use terraced wetlands instead of seawalls to deal with it. So you get multiple benefits that are in fact more resilient than seawalls. We're going to have to add 200 plus Empire State Buildings of fill to the bay, but do it in a very strategic way. And some of the people that fought one drop of fill in the bay have now moved to this much more creative and hopeful scenario, just as some of the don't cut a tree advocates have moved to the no, we need more creative forest management. So it's a very important human dynamic, not just on the ground. Here's just a little picture of the adaptation atlas that SFEI and SPUR put together to actually go by landscape units to talk about what the art of the possible was. And even if you vision it, it becomes a beautiful enhancement to even a beautiful area to begin with. Corporate arena, this is Google, I already mentioned, but not only are they looking at the amount of water they use, they're doing on-site recycling and the like to also be able to green the area and make these areas accessible to the public. And then the Klamath Dam's coming out. I'm not going to talk more. I'm just going to say this is one of the most exciting things happening. Another exciting thing before I move to the closing part is beavers. And we may laugh about beavers, but it's incredible. Having worked on this for a project the last year at the intersection of nature-based solutions and climate for water benefits, it's incredible if you start looking at what beavers do. And there are books called Eager, there's videos called Smokey the Beaver, paper, there's very hilarious phrases. Leave it to Beaver is probably one of my favorites too, but that dates me. But beavers and using beaver analogs to create mountain meadows and wetlands and slow the flow have created these oases of sanctuary during big fires, also can help prevent them and protect water. So watch that space and just look up beavers. There's a California Beaver Summit every other year. Pretty incredible issue. I'm happy to go back to, but brings me hope. And then of course, data and technology make a lot of this easier through remote sensing, sensors for treatment, finding leaks and all of that. So it also makes it less expensive, but we've got to deal with that human factor I mentioned. And I don't know what time it is, so I'm probably going way long. Let me just see if I can see. Yep, I'm long. So I'm going to try and wrap up quickly. I love this Yogi Berra quote. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. And this is where that human factor really comes in. It's easy to do cocktail party chatter about water. And all of us do it sometimes. We vent, and I try to do my venting in a bar rather than in a presentation, though some of it leaks out, which you may notice. But in general, I think it's more important to say, well, what can we do about it? And what's it going to take to make it happen? And the piece that gets left out is who's it going to take? And how can you do it in a way that engages the people across the table or people that aren't in your little circle of conversation, what Robert Greenfield calls a self-congratulatory circle, where we talk with people we agree with. Since there are a number of us, we must be right. And anybody who disagrees is either venal or evil or stupid. So just think for a minute about the way people tend to talk about the others, something Renee Henry, who's a great young biologist at Trout Unlimited, refers to as othering others, which is, he's quoting someone else, but it's a fascinating context. We do that as humans, so we have to try to not do that. There are some true jerks in the world. I'm not saying there aren't, but there are a lot more people of goodwill who just see things differently because they're getting their information in a different place. And I found that by working on oneself to be a little more patient, to ask a question before reacting to somebody, sometimes you find that They're motivated by different things. They've got different information. They're not even saying what you think they're saying. And just putting a little time into that reduces the number of jerks that are really out there. Because I find that what happens sometimes is I feel that people are talking about their perception of what somebody means rather than what somebody means. So we're having these weird conversations with ourselves rather than having them with the real people. And so I find asking questions, even from a dais, incredibly helpful and humbling, as I realized somebody actually didn't mean what I thought they meant when I jumped to a conclusion. And sometimes when you can go to what they mean and what they really care about, you can solve their problem in a different way than what they're promoting. But more importantly, if you talk to enough people, you can figure out how to get multiple benefits fixed. Okay, let me pass Yogi. I can't do the clicker. So this is what I call the challenge of ecosystem management as opposed to ecosystem management. It's really not about big egos. It's about being aware of the other people in the dynamic, either in the room in front of you or somewhere else. I mean, how many of us can say we love people, but we're not that polite or interested in what the people right in front of us have to say? I have been humbled so many times by asking a farmer, an environmentalist, a community member, an urban water agency, what they're really worried about and what they really need most. Very different from the rhetoric that they're spouting in a room necessarily, but you have to connect and ask. And the whole way the Bay Delta Accord came together, frankly, was my team meeting over coffee and drinking with people to figure out what they really needed versus what they were asking for at a microphone or in a semi-public meeting room. And that's how you get these, how you make progress, imperfect though it may be. The Chinese call this, they have a phrase I'll spare you my college Chinese inflections. It's like a chicken talking to a duck. You're talking to each other, but you're not connecting. You're not really speaking the same language. And those of you who've known me, I can do a whole hour-long training on this, but you see it as farmers and environmentalists talk past each other, as engineers talk past almost everybody else, as government people talk to non-government people, you name it. You see it everywhere once you see it in one place. Some people, when I've done the long talk, have said it's helped them with their families, but we just do that in a shorthand. And so it's just important to know that might be happening and to ask a question or two. And I can tell you a zillion stories, whether it's the smog check negotiations or where a legislator just couldn't hear what I was saying EPA wanted because he thought EPA wanted something, he thought was onerous that someone else had told him EPA wanted. It took me 3 meetings and holding up my ID card to say, I swear to God, I work at EPA, because people believe me, but they don't believe the institution. It happened in the big breakthrough, a longer story than I have time to tell, at Heal the Bay in Los Angeles, where I felt the engineer was blowing us off and I was being a brat. I thought, I'm a lawyer, I'm going to ask him this question every way I can. This is in the 80s. I finally asked the question a different way and he answered it very earnestly. And I realized he was just talking a different language and answering the question the way an engineer would answer an engineer, not the way you would talk to a community member. And as a result, I made them all review their responses to comments and all that when I eventually ran the program. But it created an entirely different relationship between the environmental community and the city that's pretty much held to this day with some burps. So there are a lot of examples, but I don't have time to do my full presentation. But just to be mindful enough to ask a question, even if it's as simple as help me understand what you're saying, help me understand why you see it that way, you'll be shocked that at least half the time the person didn't mean what you thought they meant. So this is what we need to do. We got to practice resilient relationships. We've got to use the power we have that the powerful don't want us to know about. What you do matters, what you say matters. Everyone's a potential ally that we need to bring together to make this a more livable, sustainable, and resilient place. And it's all about ecosystem management, starting with your own. Again, one of my favorite quotes about how people matter. We had him too little. And with that, I'll close just saying attitude is everything. I tend to be an optimist. I see the glasses half full because I see it as a better way to live and open a conversation. Pessimists are always mad at somebody or mad at something. It's simpler, it's our gut response, but it's not as productive. And of course, 2020 was a pretty darn weird year. So with that, let's go to Q&A. Sorry, I just gave you a lot, but hopefully that gives you a menu, and I'm happy to talk about anything you want to, can stay a little late, and can follow up with any of the questions we don't have time to get to. And Meg, I apologize if you sent me any chats when you're when you're showing it, you can't see them.
No, I didn't. I was writing them all down so we could ask them now.
Well, great.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous. We got one comment. This is a great presenter. And of course, everyone agrees. Q&A, I would point out that this video, the recording is going to be on our website. So you'll be able to rehear. And some of the questions that we won't be able to get to during the this session, if any, may be answered offline. So you can put them in the chat and we will try to get back to you after this program. The first question that came in actually was about beavers.
Oh, good.
And since you did handle it, yeah, the person then came back with asking if we can get a policy change to reduce the 1,000 depredation permits to allow more assistance in helping inconveniently located beavers relocate. And is that something, do you think, that could be done?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's on my list when I have time to join the coalition of people working on this. I mean, there's a huge coalition of people in the state working on this, and a whole network of folks. I mean, the Occidental Ecology Center, I may get that name wrong, someone can correct me in the chat. They're amazing, and they have a couple of people who are doing phenomenal work in the sort of the beaver world. But oddly enough, California is a state that doesn't allow you to translocate beavers. And so when a beaver dam floods a farmer's field or something, you go into this weird red alert, and you can, you end up killing the beaver or whatnot in other states. And I encourage you to watch a film. Oh my God, what's it called? There's a great film. I'm even in it in the beginning, just talking about drought, although I didn't know I was going to be in it. Oh my gosh, I just can't remember it. I might have to put it in on your website later on if someone knows the name of that great film. What it follows, it starts with a woman, I think in Oregon or Washington, where she goes and traps them so they won't be killed and puts them in a safer place. In California, you're not allowed to do that. So it's a vestige of a former time. So, if you want a neat little cause with really cool people, I think that's a policy issue that we can resolve. In other places, people are using what they call Beaver Dam Analogs, where you try to mimic what a beaver dam would do. But why not do it with beavers and just indemnify farmers whose parts of their flood, you can do that instead. You just indemnify them for any losses. So there's a lot of ways you can do it without killing them.
Oh, good. There are ways to remove obstacles to the.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay,
Yep.
great.
We just haven't done them in California. So.
Yeah, I know people have been advocating for beavers for some years, but I haven't a lot happen. Water is affected by policy decisions that originate in policy realms outside water, such as air, climate, equity, and kind of water is kind of like a side effect of those decisions. And the questioner cited the Owens River protections for air, which ended up protecting water. Is there anything further you could tell us about that? Is that likely to happen in the future?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, that's in that climate adaptation and nature-based solutions space. I mean, I presided when I was at EPA over the first Owens Valley air water solution back in the mid-90s. It's evolved since there. I think this notion of looking more at multiple benefits is really important. And there's some interesting quantification work going on, Pacific Institute in particular, located in Oakland, both in terms of doing a multi-benefit calculator and project to help policymakers see how by integrating water into their thinking and integrating the other benefits of doing particularly natural systems, but also green landscaping and other things, you can actually get more bang for the buck. Elevating that notion is leading to, frankly, urban green restoration for water and climate and flood control benefits. Clearly in the forest arena, ecological forest management, not just taking out trees so they don't suck up water, but actually thinking about the ecology is going to yield water benefits by decreasing fires, but also by creating mountain meadows that are good for not just for species, but for actually cleansing the water, holding it back, substituting in part for that slowing of the flow that our losing snowpack is going to do, catching some of that snowpack as opposed to it just running down in a flood. So there are a lot of arenas where dealing with climate or forest management for wildfire is going to yield water benefits. And we need to grow the capacity to think about multi-benefits. One of the most encouraging things I'm seeing, and this is a watch this space, is that in the update of the climate scoping plan that's going on this year and next, California Air Resources Board is doing a huge push on nature-based solutions and natural working lands, because they're finally owning that those expanded wildfires put a lot of carbon in the atmosphere that hadn't been counted in the pie chart they had to reduce. And they know they're not going to be able to count it all, but they know it's going to make a difference. So they're actually working closely with the Resources Agency, which just put out a climate smart draft plan, where there's actually a whole effort going on to look at these multi-benefits, including water, and say, well, let's just invest in the things that are going to get us these benefits as a whole, versus having to manage each micron or every investment for water per acre foot it yields, as opposed to recognizing that by doing these nature-based solutions, you're going to yield water, climate, and other benefits, including public safety. So there are a lot of arenas, but as I said at the beginning, and I think it's a good question, because the discourse of water is so fragmented and balkanized, we tend to talk about everything per acre foot. So even in LA, they're having UCLA doing a big study to quantify the economic value of avoiding the disruption, so that as opposed to just saying, well, if we invest in this, we'll get another acre foot of water, and comparing, recycled water to imported water, you're going to get an economic benefit to not having to import the water, because when it's disrupted, your economic harm is devastating. So that there's work going on in the economics arena to help, and again, the calculation arena. Sorry for the light coming through.
No problem.
Oops, I can't hear you. Maybe repeat it slowly.
Oops, okay, it was a question. Coach, with the that we're facing, is there any way to change the law in Santa Clara County that you could suggest?
All right, I hate to say this, but you froze. Now you're not. So try and say that one more time.
Okay. How person in Santa Clara County to ameliorate some of the water problems we have?
Oh, I think the key thing is to push for more efficiency, lawn rebates, losing your lawns, fixing leaks. Urban California uses over half of the water it uses on outdoor ornamental landscaping, most of it a lawn, and most of it keeping a lawn an artificial shade of green in August to look like a Scottish golf link. We don't need that. So either the lawns go brown in the summer, or you help people transition. And it's expensive to get to a water tolerant landscape. So that's where in Southern California, they put out over $500 million in rebates. And every time they put some out, it disappeared in a couple of weeks, because people get that they don't need it. The lawn came with the house. That's the biggest extension of our water resources, using less, with lawns being the biggest chunk. The other is leaks, and sometimes that's leaky pipes, which there are now sensors to target the right place versus having to recycle all of it. If you really want to, just the thing we should all be doing periodically is food color in the toilet tank, because those flappers start getting hard, and all you have to do is, if you put the food color in, you wait an hour, sometimes you wait overnight. If the food color makes it to your toilet bowl, you have a leaky flapper, just go to somewhere. I'm not going to advertise for a big box store, but changing the flapper is not that hard. You don't have to hire a plumber to do it. And then you're going to save a boatload of water. So those are sort of simple things. I mean, shorter showers and other things that people talk about help too, but those are the biggest picture things. And advocate for more recycling, and have the agencies back, or push the agency to do even more, because we nickel and dime because people are so sensitive about water rates, but the real answer is to figure out how to do what we need to do so it won't be even more expensive, and then how to help the people who can't afford those rates. If the answer is not to do the improvement, not to, yeah, right. That means exercise your political voice. Go to your water board meetings and speak up. Run for water board.
person who was at the dam said, you know, some of them are supposed to be filled by atmospheric rivers. And how will we know when we have, how will we know we'll have water in the dams that would benefit, you know, that would make the cost for the monetary and environmental, how would we know that?
Again, you
How
broke
is it?
up a little bit. We may have to move to chat a little bit. It may be me, but you're breaking up a little bit. It was the issue about
Okay,
how
well, we're talking about,
Yeah, maybe Meg, you can type the question in the chat.
you may be retyping it,
Yeah,
but then I can see whatever it is and can answer the question versus what I
that
think I
was
heard.
at the top of the list. Why don't we, I can type some while, meanwhile, we move on to another question then.
Okay.
Are we going to be updating our rights to reflect modern California water demands, usage, and priorities?
Wait, say that one more time. I'm so sorry.
Will water rights be updated
Oh.
to reflect California water demands, usage, and priorities?
It's a great question. I don't know. Again, not something I'd bet on, but a really interesting conversation taking place and one that I really want to do some work on. There are pieces of things that are happening. The administration put 30 million into the water board's budget to at least digitize the data we have so it's more accessible to more people to look at. That came out of a UC Berkeley study, and a lot of people who said, look, you've got these things on pieces of paper. It's impossible for someone else to see and help you. Again, keeping the discourse to a smaller group of insiders in a very strange environment. So that's somewhat positive. I think moving towards changing the water rights system overall, say the seniority system, is going to be difficult. And I think part of it is it becomes all out war, but you also have to recognize that there are whole communities that have evolved around these water rights for over 100 years. So if you changed it by ripping a Band-Aid, for example, and totally changing it, you would throw thousands of lives and economies into chaos. But there's a lot we can do to make the system we do have more enforceable and rational. Where we have a senior water rights system that comes from someone having tacked a note to a tree over 100 years ago, like San Francisco did, and recording it and then having it in perpetuity as inviolate, where when we get into curtailment in a drought situation, the juniors are curtailed 100% in favor of their seniors, creates a very challenging dynamic. It also creates a challenging dynamic for implementation, because with thousands of these that you're supposed to prioritize by the nanosecond, it ends up being this very unwieldy system for the water board. And so you either have to be able to do it by regulation, or you have to figure out how to rationalize the system through quantification, which Colorado did a version of. It took them 30 years, but they have things quantified down to, you know, the rain barrel that comes off your roof. I mean, they're the opposite end of the spectrum. And so something in between would make progress where we could have a logical discourse. And there are a lot of different options for how you might do that. But the question of whether there'll be enough political will to do the big things is a question. I mean, a group of law professors put out some recommendations just earlier this week on Monday that may seem tedious to people because they don't seem broad enough, but I thought were actually rather brilliant in terms of doable changes that would make a big difference. And again, I'm not even going to bet money on whether those could pass.
Maybe we could put those in the resources that we send out. That would be helpful.
Yeah, could do that. It's not for the faint of heart, because if you don't know the system, you might get bored, but that's the kind of tedious conversation we actually have to figure out where to go.
Great, thank you. Another question was, why isn't the public trust doctrine used more?
Well, it's actually used a lot more than people know, because a lot of times people look at the public trust doctrine in terms of reported cases that went all the way through a court or a decision, but it's actually invoked and used fairly often and in ways sometimes that get action voluntary. action on the ground. And so I know, depending on your point of view, we were accused of, or we used that and waste and reasonable use a lot during the last drought. It's one of the hallmarks of the period of time that I was at the water board. And we were establishing the importance of it as a basic principle. And we were doing it in relatively modest ways that were sure to withstand legal scrutiny. But we did things like during the drought, like using waste and reasonable use and the public trust doctrine together to say it was unreasonable for senior water rights holders, no matter how senior they are, to completely dewater Milder and Antelope Creeks, which were the last undammed refuge for salmon off the Sacramento River. And there are plenty of people who said we didn't have the authority to do that. How dare us? Water rights control. We won. We used it there. We used it in the Bay Delta standard setting. We used it on the Russian River. We used it in a number of sources. And there's been a pretty good case that says we all have to use it for groundwater too. So I think there's potential, but the reason it doesn't get used more is that, again, if you're going to take water away, you need to do an evidentiary adjudicatory hearing, which takes more staff and time than anyone has. And it's daunting. We were able to use it during the drought because we had emergency regulatory authority, and we could do it that way. So we did it a lot. So it's really a question of, I think one of the real issues is dealing with the procedures so that the water board could actually do it within their lifetime. Staffing is important too, which the report talked about. I mean, the water board's been consistently understaffed since its inception.
Do you think there's money in the current, in California currently to provide
for the
more staff?
digitization to help? Not so much on the staffing. We got more. Brown administration grew us enough that we were back to all we'd lost over the preceding decades and a little more. But the water board's task is huge and great in theory, but to execute it is you can do a fraction of what you want to do. Take 100 years to adjudicate the state streams that need to be adjudicated and public trust flows set under the current system.
Okay, should we try the dams question again? There's a
Yeah.
question about if we're filling dams with atmospheric river, it seems like a recipe for a stranded asset. How do we know we'll have enough water in the future to put in the dams? Worthwhile.
That's a good question. We will. It doesn't just dry up, it just gets more flashy. So there'll be times when we have more than enough, we have to worry about flooding. The dams won't be big enough to prevent every flood. And so we just have to figure out how to manage. I mean, part of the work on atmospheric rivers right now has gone towards being able to predict when they come so that you don't just let it go in January by a calendar, which is what the Corps of Engineers had been doing, because you're going to err on the side of caution in the wet season to not have a flood if it comes quick. And so they were artificially emptying them. I mean, you look at what almost happened to Oroville, that's because they had 2 atmospheric rivers in short order that sort of just parked right over the dam. And that was beyond what it was designed for, beyond what anyone had seen. And we're going to have more of those. But if you can see them coming, you can then let the water go only when you need to, rather than just letting it go on a calendar. Like the Lake Mendocino and Sonoma County Water Agency have been doing a lot of work. I mean, Sonoma County Water Agency is one of the most progressive water agencies looking at tools and things. And the Corps has been open to trying to do more of that work. And so the issue is just, we have to figure out how to use those dams more flexibly when we have the water, but also be aware there are going to be times when we won't have any water. I mean, building a dam doesn't make it rain more. I mean, I guess that's a part of the point of the question, but we are going to still have deluges. So managing the ones we have better are good, but the idea that you build another one and your problem solved is also a pipe dream, no pun intended.
Okay. One listener asked about injecting groundwater for storage of snow melt during our, high flows.
Mhm.
That's assuming a normal snowpack. And what can you tell us about that? And excessive groundwater pumping in the Central Valley actually accelerating? Kind of two questions.
In the short run, it has, as people, farmers like to farm. And it comes out of some of it's financial, some of it's also a calling of producing food and fiber and pride. So I think in anticipation of Sigma limiting what folks are going to be able to pump, some people want to make the best in the short run. And sometimes it's third-party investment hedge funds and others that have bought a lot of land, which is part of what led to an acceleration of the overpumping, and also led to the behind the scenes political will in agriculture to say that the state really had to make them and give them a framework for being able to throttle back because the politics made it hard for them. And so I always said that, people were coming up to me in coffee shops and bar, totally true story, and saying, you have to make us do this. Just don't say, I told you so. So so it's one of these interesting challenges. The issue, it's both injection and then creating these spreading grounds where some farmers are going to be farming water molecules, rather than plants, because they happen to be over the geological area in their community where the water will flow in faster. So there's a lot of that going on. I'm organizing a panel for the International Society for Managed Aquifer Recharge in April, because it's going to be in Long Beach, talking about some of the amazing things that people are trying to do in the Central Valley. And a lot of them are trying to do it and providing ecological benefits at the same time of ephemeral wetlands and other things. So there's a kind of win-wins going on. I mean, in the current setting, more of them have focused on that and overly rosy views of what they're going to be able to capture, because you can't capture a whole flood wall. You can capture a teeny piece of it, but a teeny piece of it can go a long way, as opposed to doing the hard demand management they're going to have to do. But fortunately, the Department of Water Resources, in this case led by the new deputy director, Paul Gosselin, who's great, called balls and strikes to say it's not cool if you overestimate it, and it's not cool if you dewater more drinking water wells. That was an amazingly important call on the part of DWR, and now those guys that were overly optimistic are going to have to go back to the drawing board. So it's kind of complicated because you can't capture it all as fast as it flows, but sometimes you can hold it in retention basins and then filter it in. You can inject it in some cases, but you got to have the retention basin to hold it in the first instant. It's not instantaneous, but there's probably 20 different ways to do it. Sorry, I keep moving. I'm trying to move away from the sun. Sorry.
Yeah. One part of that question was how can we increase groundwater recharge without increasing surface storage?
Well, you can increase little surface storage. It doesn't all have to be the big dams that are the charismatic megafauna of the talking point wars. I mean, it's a distributed storage. There are a lot of places building sort of holding tanks. So you might end up, the community will buy out a part of somebody's farm and build a retention basin to hold it and then get it into the ground after it goes by. That's time honored. It's done all over Southern California in the well-managed groundwater basins. So that's not rocket science.
There's a recent question. The LA Times recently raised concern that there's a conflict between water efficiency, recycled water availability, or between human use of recycled water and use of the water for the LA River.
Yeah.
How do we avoid the argument that one use is more important than another in the space?
Well, it's simplistic. And I was just writing about a couple of these stories with somebody in LA yesterday. I mean, on the one hand, to be fair, there aren't as many reporters as there used to be. They're supposed to write 5 stories a day. You don't have, I think Paul Rogers, where you are, is the last man standing who can write a long story from the old days. And you have some really great folks like Ian James now at the Times who will write a long story. But people tend to jump to where the conflict is or make it always pitted. The LA River story was really disappointing from an author I've talked to over the years about recycling them 30 years ago. It's not an either or. That's an easy way to write a story. It's not either or. What we're actually doing on the LA River is the state board is assessing how much needs to be left in the river for its legitimate ecological needs. And then you have to figure out how the current wastewater dischargers, which are like most of the LA River is tertiary treated and polished wastewater, that and urban slobber when it's not raining, and a little bit of groundwater seepage, but trying to figure out how much is there left to pull back out to recycle And then they'll divvy it up amongst themselves, or the state board will divvy it for them. I mean, it's a both and. We can have the ecological values of that unpaved stretch of the road of the river, which are great. You can kayak down it, and maybe a little bit below, and still recycle plenty of it. But all or nothing is a very simplistic view at looking at something. It's much more complex, but much more real to figure out, okay, how do we maximize all of those benefits? And most importantly, environmental benefits are a benefit. They're not in opposition. People need natural places, particularly in a place like Los Angeles.
Yeah, thank you. I've turned off my video because one of our listeners suggested it might make it.
Oh yeah, it's a good idea.
Better. Yeah. Okay. Much of the vast landscape is institutional, begins the question, such as it used by schools, cemeteries, city parks, and so forth. Are there or can there be incentives for public agencies to reduce these vast lawn acreages only to where they're really needed for a purpose, and not just as a default option for covering space?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a great question. That's definitely out there. Actually, before we did the 25% cut during the drought, we thought about saying that it was waste and unreasonable use to water a lawn, commercial and or institutional lawn, with potable water if you were in X distance of a recycled water line. They may get there. I think that could be true. I also think eventually our landscape codes are going to change. You have some communities that have already done that to really discourage lawns and institutional landscaping, but that's definitely an important direction to go. There's no reason you need ornamental landscaping that's a lawn. You really, it's pretty, right? But it's a very expensive and costly in terms of water use for no good purpose. It's definitely, there's a higher beneficial use. I mean, sometimes you do have functional turf. This is what Las Vegas just banned, all non-functional turf. And then the issue turns to what is your definition of functional? And, you've seen golf courses that have recontoured. You've seen cemeteries that have done it, less so perhaps. You've seen them go brown. We're our first customers for recycled water in Los Angeles, off the Tillman and LA Glendale plant. A lot of golf courses and cemeteries use recycled water. They're the major consumers of it, because why not? So there's a lot of different tools we could use getting to where Las Vegas has gone, which is the outright ban, which, I would bet money on. That will happen in the next decade.
All right, thank you. There's a question about blended water, including from a Superfund site, being safe, assuming the safety thresholds are not later found to be inaccurate or incomplete. And this person is thinking about concerns. And kind of question is, the Central Valley is a use of produced water that's from fracking, recycled fracking water to irrigations. But there are major questions about safety. So can you tell us anything about, these different water?
Yeah,
blended water.
Water. I heard most of it. I think you can do it. I mean, you can treat almost anything. It's just a question of how much it costs. But this issue of confidence is an important one. And it kind of depends on what your faith in the institutions are. In general, California's water agencies do a really good job. And I say that as someone who's been disappointed in them on some fronts in my last job, but they actually do a pretty good job, and the regulatory oversight is pretty good, particularly in the drinking water arena, which I think people realize they want to meet it 24/7. There are a sliver of them in the urban and the rural context, though, that just don't have what it takes to do it. And so you've got to be particularly careful with your water sources, which is why, for example, when the recycled water standards come out for direct potable reuse, people will view what the drinking water division comes up with as being too strict. And it should be at start, because meeting these standards 24/7 is not for the faint of heart. So you really only want the agencies that are willing to go the extra mile, to have extra barriers and redundancies doing this when you have a source that starts with a heavy contamination, either from chemicals or pathogens. And so it really has to do with your confidence in the water agency itself. And sometimes that's better happening at a larger scale. So for example, Metropolitan taking on this massive recycling project with LA County Sand is going to be easier to regulate and manage and feel confident in than 25, 30, or 50 small agencies trying to do this high level of work. So that becomes kind of, again, a little bit in the weeds. I heard you talk about produced water, and that's an interesting issue because one of those issues where there may be more heat than light, but it's not wrong to have concerns, right? So you have, I know that Region 5 had a whole food safety expert panel. We did this a lot doing with recycled water, where you're not just relying on your own scientists, but you're bringing in outside experts that meet in public so that everybody has a chance to kind of flag their issues. And their report actually found that it can be pretty safe. And I would say it depends on all of these. It depends who's doing it, who's monitoring it, how is it looked at. And in the oil and gas arena, there's a lot of other issues that come into play, but there's a lot of legitimate fear because of extra chemicals that are added. The vast bulk of the water is not fracking in California. Fracking just has more, it does have exotic chemicals, it does have issues. So I'm not saying it's not important. It is. We spent a lot of time and have the toughest rules in the country, but the actual volume of oil and gas water is much bigger than just the fracking. So I'm just saying I wouldn't limit myself to that. But I mean, that's an arena where you've got to just make sure, and you've got to understand that whoever's doing the treatment is doing it well, and that there's strong oversight, and that they're doing not just the minimum, but doing bells, whistles, belt suspenders, flying monkeys. I mean, my view on these things has always been that it's penny wise and pound foolish to try and either game the system and make the minimum to save a little money, when in fact, if you're doing something hard, what you want is a tough regulatory regime that makes you do more than the minimum, and then you do more than they make you do if you want to have any hope of the public trusting what you do, because the public doesn't necessarily trust government either. So I used to like giving speeches to in the oil industry and other places that if you stink, boom, or glow in the dark, metaphorically or physically, the idea of meeting minimum standards being a badge of honor is foolish. So again, you have to really look at the capacity of the person. It may well be that's not the best place to go. I mean, brackish water desal in a lot of those areas is going to be cheaper, safer, and less fraught. So it just depends on the situation in a given place.
Thank you. There's a question about someone wanting to know what resources there are to educate oneself to be a more effective advocate and participant in local and state water issues, such as SIGMA stakeholder discussions with state assembly members about water storage. People can feel unable to conversation because there are some who have such strongly embedded viewpoints and data. And you a bit.
Yeah, I think when I heard that, I do think that's a good question. And there are a number of different places. I mean, the easiest place to go is to join a group that has good advocacy skills and ride along, and become a part of it. I mean, for me, I was a lawyer and an organizer at the Center for Law, and that's my natural bent. But I think one of the things that Heal the Bay did in LA, which I was, proud to be their lawyer and one of the co-founders and an officer and all that sort of thing. My life was sewage for quite a while. Is get yourself together with folks that are focused on results rather than just beating the other guys, and watch, listen, and contribute. And spend time also listening to the legitimate views of people that others vilify, because usually there's a good heartfelt reason. And it's just as much fear, it's just different fear. I mean, even if you think about ag issues and fish issues, environmental community, it feels they've lost the battle and they're losing species, and it's emotionally tough. And so it's hard to be not mad or unreasonable and to put forward arguments that aren't they're bad and we're good. I mean, people do, you have to be aware of the fact that we all default to wanting to feel good about ourselves. In the ag world, you have people who are proud of growing food and fiber and feel, offended that people talk about them as if they're polluters or trying to kill a fish, when in fact, the impact of their actions collectively are polluting or killing a fish, right? So it's all about how do you want to work with people who are sensitive to other people and problem solvers. And sometimes that means you're working on kind of tedious issues, it seems, but working on what it really takes. I'll give you one And there are classes and stuff. You can join leadership training programs like the Water Education Foundation or the Water Solutions Network, but there are great activists everywhere. You just have to not go to the people who are just screaming that the other guys are devils and you're saints. That's the thing I would say to watch for. But people who truly want to learn and know. I mean, just one example. I remember when we were Heal the Bay, of course we were crusading against the city on this and to try and get attention. And that conversation with the city engineer I mentioned was a real aha and epiphany that, gosh, these guys, when we asked if they'd let their kids swim in the bay, they said, hell no. I mean, and so all of a sudden it opened this whole conversation as humans that completely transformed the conversation. But if you listen to the way we had been talking, it sounded like we thought those guys went to the plant every morning to manufacture sewage to dump in the ocean to kill a fish or, give a lifeguard an earache. But in fact, they were hardworking civil servants who were underpaid and under-resourced, dealing with a river of human waste coming at them 24 hours a day without the resources they needed. So we shifted gears towards City Hall to get them those resources. So Heal the Bay is the best thing that ever happened to those guys. And that's why you have this happy thing. But it took an epiphany that didn't happen overnight. Similarly, when the mayor's office, you got a new deputy mayor, who's the one who brought me in to run public works years later, which was a bizarre thing to have done anyway. When he listened to us and came out of his chair and things started happening, and he issued a 10-point plan to heal the bay. And we had a meeting, our next meeting, we sat around and we thought, oh, whoa, they're saying they're going to do everything we asked. And we just were stunned. And the first question someone asked was, well, wow, now what will we talk about? And then I thought for a minute and I said, hey, we could declare victory and just oversee them. And we all started laughing because it had never occurred to us that we could win that way. And then became the hard work of implementing, overseeing. We hired our first staffer, Mark Gold, who's a hero. He was a young graduate student. He was our first staff scientist, so that we would have credibility in overseeing what they were doing. So we totally shifted gears. But if you would come to us in the beginning, we were just as righteous and flame throwing as anybody. So you've got to find people who are capable of that and who do it well. And those people, I mean, I'll stack my track record on actually getting stuff done with my, Donna Reed approach. I mean, I can be tough sometimes, as people on the call know, but you got to know when to be tough and call it, and when to figure out how you can make progress by, saying thank you when someone gives you 80% of what you asked for.
Right. I think we are unfortunately running really close to the end of our session. Really it's been fabulous. All the comments in the chat have been, this is great presenters, really knows how to bring things together,
thank you.
Bring people together. This has been really great to read. I've been kind of a little focused, maybe too much. What we'd like now is to move to thinking about our additional resources, but just express really, first of all, our extreme gratitude to you for what you have brought to us and what you've brought to California and our listeners far away. As I understand, someone from Massachusetts is on this this webinar. So it's been so thank you so much. And
well, thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to answer some of those questions offline. And I failed to acknowledge, and I wanted to acknowledge first and foremost, Pat Ferraro, who just popped up on the screen, who's one of my mentors and really, really helped me understand what was happening in the South Bay and beyond on recycling and other things when I came as a sort of a green Southern California kid to run US EPA. I'm forever indebted. So in a Wayne's World way, I'm not worthy. Thank you, Pat, for joining.
That's ridiculous, Felicia. We're helping each other, and I'm glad we were both there.
And thank you both for all you've done in the water world. It's really been fabulous. So we'll move on to our next slide, which highlights some of our additional resources. And of course, what we're going to be we'll sure this is not I was expecting. Okay. First, we'll start with this one first. Our next, this is a program that was going to be coming up shortly. We just learned this week that Susana Dianda, who is the Community Water Center in the Central Valley, who will speak on environmental justice and water, is going to be speaking to us on a Zoom call, February 24th at 5 p.m. And it's been sponsored by the League of Women Voters of California Water Committee. And happily, they've made it available to all of us so that we'll be able to participate and listen to Susana Diana, who is a fabulous organizer, community organizer, she does nonprofit environmental justice work. She's gotten numerous, and you can read that all on the screen. She's really terrific, and she kind of, I'm guessing she probably follows in your footsteps, Felicia. She's been great. Yeah. And next slide. We will of course be making these slides from Felicia available along with the recording and the video on our website. And look, we'll be sending messages out to people who have who've registered for this. Look for a message, and please, you'll probably want to review this. One fast talk and something that we could all benefit from hearing a number of times. There are other resources here, 2 more sections of slides. There's a movie, Brave Blue World, Racing to Solve Our Water Crisis. This screened that last year for some of our members and some of the community members, but it's available on Netflix. It's very worthwhile. It explains water recycling, freshwater needs, ends up, I think, in California. So it back to home at the very end. Very interesting. As Felicia mentioned, Water 4.0 by David Sedlak is, I think, the best short book available on water resources and what you really should know about water. And the other one, but they're also great reads. Worth looking at if you're looking into finding out more about water. So next slide, please. Again, thank you for attending. Really close to our, if Sophia has further announcements.
Thank you, Meg and Felicia, for sharing with such an insightful, important topic this morning. And thank you everyone's participation. So for today's recording and all these additional resources, you will receive them in the email, in the follow-up email, which will be sent out by our staff. Okay, so before we wrap up today's meeting, I would like to invite anyone who would like to take a group picture with us. Okay, so you please, everyone can turn on your video.